I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of our two 1988 Killian Award lectures. The James R. Killian Jr. Faculty Achievement Award to recognize extraordinary professional accomplishments. A tribute to Dr. Killian, one of the great figures at MIT in this century, has been established since 1972. A special faculty committee selects the award winner each year who presents the academic lectures. This year's recipient is Professor J.W. Forrester of the Sloan School of Management. You'll be hearing from him very shortly. My job today, I think, above all, is to keep the introduction short. I'm mindful of a story of an event that took place at a Yale commencement when the commencement speaker announced that he was going to take as his text something that would suit all the letters in Yale, and he proceeded to announce that he was going to speak about youth, age, life, and education. He began his speech and droned on for a half hour. At the end of a half hour, hadn't even gotten beyond the letter A of Yale. And at that point, one platform guest turned to another and said in a loud voice, "Thank God we're not at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology." With that story in mind, I had fleeting thoughts of going through the letters and saying that today's lecture will speak about modeling, accuracy, social systems, etc., but I gave it up as a bad idea. Let me turn quickly to Professor Forrester. I think in life, origins are often important, and you might be interested to know that Professor Forrester grew up on a homestead cattle ranch in Nebraska. He told me the other day that at the age of 13, he put in a wind-powered electrical system, which was the first electricity available on that ranch. I commented that it seemed kind of a young age already to be tinkering with electrical equipment. Professor Forrester's comeback was, anything was better than taking care of cattle. He studied electrical engineering at the University of Nebraska and got a graduate degree from MIT in the same subject. By age 28, he was director of the MIT Digital Computer Laboratory, where he was responsible for the design and construction of Whirlwind 1, one of the first high-speed computers. At about that time, he invented the magnetic storage system that was the standard memory device for computers for the next 20 years. As head of the Digital Computer Division at Lincoln Laboratory, he was responsible for the planning and design of the SAGE air defense system built in the 1950s. Since 1956, Professor Forrester has been professor of management at the Sloan School. He pioneered a new field known as system dynamics, which you'll be hearing about in this week's lecture and next week's. And he's been Germershausen Professor of Management since 1972. His books include Industrial Dynamics, Principles of Systems, Urban Dynamics, World Dynamics, and most recently, Collected Papers. He also has another book in the works that you'll hear something about next week. He's been the recipient of many honorary degrees and awards. I'll mention only two, the Poulsen Gold Medal from the Danish Academy of Technical Sciences and membership in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. At this time, I'd like to read the citation that's presented to Professor Forrester in connection with the award. We honor Professor Forrester and announce his appointment as lecturer in recognition of his pioneering achievements in the development of digital computers and their early application to large-scale problems of national defense, and in the creative use of computer science and the insights of engineering feedback processes and the analysis of managerial and social systems. He's left his mark on some of the most important technological advances and critical national issues of our day. I'd like to present you with the award, Jay.
This is indeed a great honor, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I would suggest that since we have lost Jim Killian from amongst our midst, that perhaps we stand for a moment of remembrance and silence. I especially regret that Jim Killian is not with us, because I feel that I owe him a very personal debt for even being here today. It was at the Lincoln Laboratory in 1955 when we had pretty well completed our responsibilities for getting the Sage Air Defense System underway that I had begun to wonder what I would do next. For some of you who have come into the field more recently, it may seem a little strange to say that I felt the pioneering days of computers were over at that time. But we had been in the work for 10 years or more, and I was looking for something else to do. It was on the occasion of Jim Killian bringing a group of distinguished visitors to the Lincoln Laboratory, and just walking down the hallway beside him, that he called my attention to the new management school that MIT was getting underway, and suggested that it might be something that I would find of interest. And indeed, that led to what we are talking about today. It has been suggested to me that these lectures are more a personal statement than they are a concentrated, intense, scientific lecture. I'm going to follow that advice and try to present a mixture of philosophy, some details so you know what the field is like, applications, purpose, and the goals that I see coming up in the future. There will be two lectures. This is a brief outline of today's lecture. I want to talk some about the MIT background that leads into the subject of social systems, their dynamic behavior that we're discussing today. It is primarily a feedback loop viewpoint, or a viewpoint of the endogenous behavior of systems. What is it about their structure and their internal policies that produce their successes and failures? Today I'll give you an example drawn from the corporate world to illustrate the approach followed. Then I want to talk about the incorporation of psychological variables, some important ideas in the perspective of building models, say a few words about people in systems, and some discussion of the general characteristics that we have found apply to most systems. And then next week, we'll turn more to the applications of the field of system dynamics with a discussion of some corporate examples, urban growth and behavior, work that we did several years ago on the world environmental system, pollution, industrialization, agriculture, and population. My present work, which is largely on economic behavior, give you a brief thumbnail sketch of that, and then talk some about the future of the field and where it is going. Through both of these lectures, I want to stress the idea of combining mental models with computer models. The mental models are largely what the world runs on. It is our mental models govern our behavior, most of our institutions. The extent to which we do not understand those systems, I think, can be augmented and improved through combining mental models with computer models. And this is a field that's beginning on an experimental basis to find its way into the high schools. And I think that is very exciting because it stands some chance of changing the way people look at the world around them and the way in which they understand politics, social systems, corporations. And beyond that, I see the field as ultimately providing a bridge between the two cultures of technology and the liberal arts or humanities, because both of these branches of our life have dynamic behavior, and there is a foundation under both of those aspects of existence that have common ideas, common principles that, when they are perceived, give people, I think, a much greater mobility between fields, much more penetrating insight into what is going on. Now, why should we be concerned about any of this? I think we take our motivation right out of the newspaper headlines. We're not very happy with the world we see around us, the political world, the social and economic world. It is filled with various kinds of problems and difficulties. And there's been not much improvement over the last 1,000 years, 2,000 years, in the understanding of such systems. As someone, I think maybe it was B.F. Skinner, pointed out, that if the ancient Greeks could come back now and walk among us, they would not understand anything about our technology and our science. They wouldn't understand the reasons, the philosophy, the details, the techniques. It would all be totally foreign. But they would be quite at home in our social problems. Wars, various kinds of difficulties. And I'm reminded when we visited that great set of castles, the Alhambra, built by the Moors in Spain above Granada, some 700-800 years ago. The guide who was taking us around pointed out one particular room, and he said this is where they met to discuss their problems of inflation and the unfavorable balance of trade, which suggests that very little has happened in our ability to both understand and to deal with these kinds of social and economic difficulties. I think it need not be that way. And so I hope to give you some kind of some vision of the possibility of this changing over the next several decades. It is not going to happen quickly, but I think we can come to a better understanding of our social and economic systems, to a more effective education in the whole span from high school through college, a way to unify intuition with rigorous analysis, and to provide a common foundation that underlies all fields: business, medicine, economics, environmental change, technological development, population, standard of living. These are all tied together in some great systems that are only at this stage dimly perceived. Let me back up to the relevant history growing out of work at MIT. Now, there is a prior history that goes back much further than this diagram suggests. Here I've presented some of the background for the field of computers and the field of information feedback systems, feedback control systems, servo mechanisms, cybernetics, all terms that mean approximately the same thing. The history of computers goes back more than 100 years. Charles Babbage, Lady Lovelace in the middle of the 1800s, wrote some very elegant papers about the nature of digital computers and the programming of them. In the same way, the history of feedback control systems goes back more than 100 years. Perhaps the first really scientific paper that I'm aware of was written by Clerk Maxwell, better known to most of you as the person who developed Maxwell's equations for the propagation of radio and light through space. But in 1867, before the Royal Society in London, he developed a paper called On Governors. And it was an analysis of the stability and the behavior of the flyball governor that was being used for governing steam engines such as James Watt had developed. Not an easy problem, because if one tries to control speed very closely, very precisely, one can produce a system with instability that will tear apart the machinery. If you reduce the sensitivity of the system, you then find that it doesn't control accurately. And there has been a perennial problem in engineering to develop control systems, feedback systems that had the desired characteristics. Somewhat later, early 1900s, there were Russian scientists who began to develop the same ideas in terms of the automatic steering of surface ships. And then I think the field really began to take off in the 1930s with the Bell Telephone Laboratories developing electronic feedback amplifiers as an essential part of the transcontinental telephone system. At MIT, the thread that I want to call attention to began with Vannevar Bush, who was behind the development of the mechanical differential analyzer, a machine that was still operating up here in Building 10 when I came to MIT in 1939. It was a rather massive mechanical machine having 6 integrators and some plotting tables where people could cause a pointer to follow curves to put in nonlinear functions. It was practical and I believe was used to a considerable extent. The Rockefeller differential analyzer was a machine with electronic switching, much easier to set up, not electronic but electrical relay switching, much easier to set up as you changed from one problem to another. And then in the digital computer days, TX0, the IBM 704 were some of the first digital computers other than Whirlwind that were at MIT. Bush was the person who guided Harold Hazen, who later came to be head of the electrical engineering department. And Hazen was the person behind the network analyzer, an analog assembly of components for studying the stability and the transient behavior of electrical power systems. And it was Harold Hazen who inspired Gordon Brown, whose doctoral thesis was a cinema intergraph, I believe an idea that might have originated with Norbert Wiener. And Gordon Brown started in 1940 the Servo Mechanisms Laboratory, which is where I entered this stream of activity. As has already been said, I studied electrical engineering at the University of Nebraska and came here for graduate study. At that time, electrical engineering was almost the only academic field that had a well-developed treatment of dynamics. And I think there's a reason for this. It is in electrical engineering that simple, linear, solvable systems are still practical and important, or were at that time. In other words, electrical engineering had that unique characteristic of importance and simplicity that was amenable to the kind of analysis that was available at that time. And so there was a development hand in hand of transients, dynamics, methodology for dealing with dynamic behavior and with feedback systems. I came and worked for 1 year with John Trump in the field of Van de Graaff generators, high voltage direct current million volt generators being applied to medical treatment. And then in 1940 was commandeered by Gordon Brown to work on what became the beginning of the Servo Mechanisms Laboratory, which launched in a major way the understanding of feedback systems as applied to military equipment and to chemical process control. The Whirlwind computer was, I think, the primary force leading to the creation of the Lincoln Laboratory, because it was with the Whirlwind computer that the first experimental demonstration of digital computers in combat information centers and the first demonstrations were made. And then the Division 6, the part of Lincoln Laboratory that did the Sage Air Defense System, spun off to become the present MITRE Corporation. Now, through all of that, there was the development of dynamics, feedback concepts, using computers for simulation, and a lot of practical experience with people in systems. Through it all, however, I think very few of us, not I, and I think very few others, saw feedback control systems as something within which we live and to which we are largely subservient. Feedback control systems were engineering devices at that time, and you built control systems, you built systems to control military equipment or chemical plants or later spaceships, but they were seen as a part of technology and not as a part of nature and human affairs. I want to suggest to you that feedback control systems are fundamental to anything that changes through time, including all of the world within which we are embedded and all the processes that we take part in. My move to the management school following Jim Killian's suggestion was largely negotiated by Eli Shapiro, who was Associate Dean of the Management School at that time, and Edward Bowles, who was earlier a professor in communications in the electrical engineering department here. I came in to give some attention to a vision that I was told Alfred Sloan had when he gave the money to start the management school here. As it was told to me, Sloan felt that a management school in a technological environment would develop differently from one in a liberal arts environment, differently from the management schools at Harvard and Columbia and Chicago, maybe better, but in any case different, and it was worth $10 million to run the experiment. The school had not done anything prior to it had been in existence officially for 4 years, started in 1952. I joined it in 1956. And the question was, what could I bring to a management school from the technological side of MIT? Others presumed, and I think I also did, that this probably meant the use of computers for handling management information, or else pushing forward the field of operations research, which was then dealing with many of the same kinds of problems that you see it dealing with today. I had my first year with nothing to do except to try to decide why I was there. And in that process, laid aside both of those potential objectives. Laid aside the use of computers for data processing because it seemed that the manufacturing companies, the banks, and the insurance companies were by that time developing such a momentum in the area of the managerial use of computers that it was unlikely we could have any further major influence on that field, at least at that time. And in looking at the field of operations research, very interesting, worthwhile, but it did not seem to really deal with the big issues that related to the success and failure of corporations. And it was out of discussions with people in industry, largely some people in General Electric at that time, that I began to look at a different class of problem. They were, in that particular case, much disturbed by the way in which their household appliance division was experiencing overtime 1 year and half the people laid off 3 years later. And what was it that was causing this? You could blame it on the business cycle, but that wasn't very persuasive. And we found that if you would take the policies that they were following for the hiring of people and the management of production, and even just sit down and do a hand simulation on a notebook page of what would happen week by week if those policies were followed and they hired people and they produced and they built up inventories and they looked at inventories and backlogs to see what they would do next in production, that you in fact had a highly unstable system that would exhibit major fluctuations of production even without any reason coming in from the marketplace. That was the beginning, and then we worked in a number of other corporations where we began to see that in general the difficulties of an organization arise not from outside influences, as almost all of us would like to think, but rather from what we do ourselves. Now, the field of system dynamics, which has been developed at MIT since the 1950s, deals with high-order, nonlinear systems involving the interactions of people, nature, and technology based on the feedback structure viewpoint, and combines a high input from the mental models in the world around us, converting those into computer models so that we come to understand better what those models imply. And by now, there is a System Dynamics Society, international society that holds annual meetings in such places as Oslo in the United States, and last summer in Shanghai, China, this coming summer in San Diego, and the year after that in Germany. Society of some 300 members at the present time, relatively small, but growing steadily. Recently has begun to publish a journal, the System Dynamics Review. There are various ways of looking at this field, and looking at where it comes from is one way. I see three background threads converging into the field of system dynamics. The traditional information that exists in our managerial and political systems, principles that come in from the field of feedback systems, and computer simulation. And we're dealing here with an effort to combine the strengths of the mental models, which we use all the time, and avoid the weaknesses in those models, while we use computer models to provide the strengths available from that domain and avoid the weaknesses in the field of computer modeling. If we look at traditional management and politics, one of the greatest strengths is the tremendous database that is available, the experiences and the knowledge in people's heads. I'll say more about that later. But that in turn is one of the weaknesses. We're overwhelmed with information, and perhaps one of the most serious pollutions that we face is information pollution. Too much information. And within that paradigm, there are generally no criteria for what information you can throw away or what you do with the information that you keep. It is from feedback systems that we can get a number of insights, principles of selecting information and principles of organizing that information into structure, coming up with a model. Now, system dynamics does not impose models on you for the first time. All your actions, every action you take, is a consequence of you using a model. One does not have a family or a university or a city or a country in one's head. One has assumptions about those systems, and one manipulates those assumptions. And in so doing, you're using a model. The question then is, where are the strengths and weaknesses in those models? The strengths lie in the tremendous amount of information available. The weakness arises from our inability to manipulate high-order, nonlinear dynamic systems in our heads, and so we very often take the information that's quite valid and produce with it results that are inconsistent with the assumptions that we are making. I want to stress the feedback viewpoint. In some ways it's very simple, and in other ways it's extremely subtle and difficult to grasp. Most of our conversations in cocktail parties and Congress and boards of directors meetings, I think, have the characteristic of saying, here's our problem, we will take a certain action, and we'll get a result, and we'll cure the problem. An open-ended system, problem, action, result, period, you're through, but it doesn't usually work. And it doesn't work partly because that's the wrong image of the world. The far more appropriate image is to see the world as a circular, ongoing process in which there's no beginning and no end. Information about a problem leads to action. The action produces a result which is the information about the next state of affairs. And one is continuously acting in a system that is continuously reacting and continuously presenting one with a new state of affairs to which one reacts. And this ongoing system is the real environment in which we live, and it is a very dynamic environment. It is a very complex environment, and it's one that on the whole we have not historically had the means to understand and cope with. That situation, I think, is now changing. Let me dwell on this matter of the simplicity of such systems a bit more. If I were to ask you casually what happens when you get a drink of water, you would probably say, well, the water flows out of the faucet and fills the glass. That is half right. It would be just as correct to say that what goes on in filling a water glass is that the rising water shuts off the faucet. That would be the other half. That it is a circular control process with a goal, reaching a certain water level, and a control system that observes where we are, where we want to be, and provides the necessary control to achieve the desired results. If we were to stylize that, we would have a diagram of this sort, represented by a first-order differential equation, if you want to look at it that way. There are some very general characteristics of systems which are illustrated even in this high degree of simplicity. Every system has in it two concepts, and only two. Now that may strike you as surprising. You may not believe it even after these lectures are over, but when you come to believe it, it is a powerful concept. Because as you look at the world around you in all its complexity and realize that everything you're looking at is one or the other of these two classes, it is a powerful simplifying idea. And these two classes are the system state, the integrations, the accumulations that go on in our systems, information about the system state or accumulations, and a policy, or what we often call a rate equation, a policy that states how nature or how a technological system reacts to the state of affairs to control an action stream, which in turn changes the system level. Another characteristic, all systems have this circular loop structure, very much more complicated in the practical systems, but always this structure in which there is a rate, a level, they alternate with each other as you move through the system, a goal, sometimes implicit, sometimes a little hard to identify, but a goal that the system is trying to achieve, where the state of affairs is compared with a goal. That goal may be dynamic itself and changing to govern action. Now, if you go just a little more complicated, and only 5 times more complicated, which is not very much, you will get a system that looks like this. I suggest you not try to read it. We'll talk about this a little more next time. The interaction of population, industrialization, resources, agriculture, and pollution in some studies that we did in the early 1970s. But I put this up to show how quickly the apparent complexity can mount as you add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels, because each level is potentially an input to every rate of flow, and the rates of flow in turn control the levels. And so one rapidly builds up a high degree of complexity. Now, when you appoint a person to be head of a corporation or elect someone to be president or to Congress, you are, in effect, patting that person on the back and saying, I'd like to have you go in there and by intuition and guesswork and compromise, solve for me a 30th order nonlinear differential equation. I doubt that there are many in this room that would venture if I put a simple third or fourth order linear differential equation on the board. I doubt that there are very many that would venture to come up and sketch by inspection the behavior of that particular equation. We have, in other words, assigned our leaders what are technically impossible tasks. And it's no wonder that we're unhappy with the usual results. Let me try to make this a little more tangible by taking up one example. An example out of the corporate world. We could have taken it out of the technological world or social or economics, but the problem of corporate or market growth, a very important question to any company, especially new startup companies. They may exhibit symptoms of low profits, little growth in sales, large order backlog, falling market share, and they almost always blame it on their competitors or their bankers or their customers, whereas in effect, in actuality, it is almost always a consequence of the interactions which they are managing between their sales effort, their production and delivery delay, their own incentives to expand, and how they set prices. The structure of such a system, simplified but sufficient for the purpose, would look something like this, where orders come in, they go into an order backlog, the backlog is filled out of the production process, the sales bring in revenue, and some fraction of those sales go into the sales budget and are used to hire salesmen, which bring in orders. Now, over on the other side, there is the idea of a delivery delay. You have an order backlog of 1,000 items to be filled, and you're making 200 of them a week. It's going to take you 5 weeks to get through that order backlog and fill the next order. And so the production rate in the backlog will indicate to you what the delivery delay is as the customer will see it. How long will the customer have to wait for his order? And the delivery delay is also one of the primary inputs to the incentive to expand. If we're running behind in our orders, then it is an indication that we should expand production. And up in here, delivery delay makes the product less attractive to the customer and makes it harder for the salesman to sell orders. And I want to give you some detail in a moment, but the trap that many companies find themselves in, and in fact, the whole U.S. economy with respect to Japan is significantly within this trap. We deliver poorly, deliver slowly, deliver low quality, deliver unsuitable products. A whole set of things come in here that make the product less attractive. We try then to sell harder and harder. We may lower price in order to sell, not realizing that price generally is not the problem, it is the character of the product. We lower price, and then pretty soon we have no revenues to solve the real problems which lie over here in the production capacity or the design or the quality. I want to carry you to a small level of detail so you have a glimpse of some of the things that lie underneath this field. I said there are two kinds of equations, the level equations or system states. These are simply accounting statements of integration or accumulation. That the present order backlog, time k being what we use to represent the present, is the backlog at the previous time interval j, plus the solution interval, how long it was since the last time you computed this, multiplied by the incoming orders minus the production rate, the orders that you filled. And dimensional consistency being as important here as it is in any of the engineering fields, you have to make sure that in fact you've set up equations where the dimensional analysis is correct. Now the level equations or integrations seem pretty simple and straightforward, and yet, as I'll say later, they are the place where all the dynamics come from, and they are tremendously important. And in the social sciences, there has been a tendency to underrate the level equations and to leave them out and to look at equilibrium states and differences between equilibrium states without having put in the system levels that allow input flow rates to differ from output flow rates, and it's in this differing of the flow rates in and out of the system states or levels that the dynamic behavior of all systems is generated. The other variable are the policy statements or the rate control equations, and they are more subtle and less obvious and a great deal more complicated in a model formulation. And I'd like to distinguish two ideas: a policy as distinguished from a decision. A policy is the set of rules that govern how decisions are made. The rules arise, the policies arise, from physical laws, from availability of information. One cannot base a decision on information one does not have. So you look at a system and see what information is available. That often tells you a great deal about what can or cannot happen. Psychological attitudes, organizational structure, traditions, what have we always done here? Powerful influence on how decisions are made. Orders from superiors, power centers, who are people afraid of, social conditioning, all of these are part of the policy structure of an organization. And you can learn a lot about these if you know what to look for, simply by sitting for extended periods of time and talking to people in organizations and see what goes on, see what has happened in various past crises, find out why they did what they did at certain times in the past, and you will be amazed at how much personal and confidential information will come out in that kind of discussion, which is very illuminating as to how the organization works. And then the decisions are the actions that are taken as a consequence of two things: the governing policies and the state of affairs that exist now. In other words, the condition of the system is one input to action, and how we analyze and how we react to those conditions, in other words, the policies, are the other ingredient. And so one has a combination of what's coming in from the system and how the particular decision point reacts that determines what will be done at any particular moment in time. And a policy statement can be simple like this, or it can run to dozens of equations that are interrelated. But basically, here the orders coming into this company that we just looked at depends on the number of persons, number of salesmen, depends on the normal sales that a salesman can make under some normal or ideal set of conditions, and multiplied by the sales effectiveness that I spoke of a moment ago. In other words, as the sales effectiveness declines because delivery delays are getting worse, it is harder and harder to sell the product, and the yield from salesmen falls. And this is a policy statement about how orders are generated in real life and in the model. Real life will have a great deal more to it, more complexity, but that's a central core of what goes on. Now let's look at the idea of the sales effectiveness. I'm giving you this by way of just illustrating ideas, not to really make you familiar with that particular model. You get a lot of the information about systems by talking to people about what would happen under extreme circumstances that have never been experienced. Because a lot of our knowledge about systems lies out in the region where, in fact, we have no experience. If I were to, I won't take time for the experiment, but it's fun to not put this curve up first, but to ask people, what is the relationship between sales effectiveness and delivery delay? Well, first of all, a third of the audience at least will present a curve that is obviously something versus time, not sales effectiveness versus delivery delay. But as the conversation converges, and it takes only about 10 minutes or 15, one will find that essentially everyone agrees that there is some delivery delay that is short enough that the customer does not care. Now, this may be 5 seconds for some product across the drugstore counter. It might be a year for some piece of heavy machinery that you have to do your own planning for and design and build a building for. But for every product, there is some delivery delay below which the delivery delay does not affect orders and therefore a horizontal line. And then there is a region where the customer becomes sensitive and orders are going to fall off as you have to wait longer and longer and longer. But they don't go through the axis, they tail off because wherever you are out here, there will be some special customer that will wait a little longer, or you can sell a little harder, or be a little nicer, or be more persuasive, and you can probably get one more order out there. So it's a curve that has this shape. Now you can establish that very solidly out of the sheer logic of talking about it. And in a particular case, for a particular product, you can probably say approximately what's the delivery delay at this point by just thinking about your own experiences, but it does not matter in this kind of analysis that you get this 50% point exactly right. The thing that matters is that there is a downward sloping section, because it is that downward sloping section that forces the market demand down to the capacity of the organization. Most companies think that the customers supply orders and they are independent of the company, and the company simply reacts to orders. In fact, the market is reacting to the company. And this is a powerful function in all markets. What happens to you if you call up an airline to make a reservation? First thing that happens is you're put on hold. You call up a competing airline going to the same city, and you're put on hold. Here you have airlines sitting out there, all with empty seats, all giving you discounts to ride with them, all doing frequent traveler things, and the market is dividing in proportion to their ability to answer the phone. In other words, they are shutting people off by the lack of capacity, the delivery delay in taking an order. That delivery delay can be products, it can be how long the switchboard takes to answer, it can be all kinds of shortcomings in the view of the customer. And so what does that do? Well, in companies and even in economies, it produces this kind of behavior. Start out with a nice, adequate production capacity and have a good product, and sales grow. This is now a curve versus time. Sales grow. And then, without people quite realizing it, they come to a capacity limitation. In fact, people like to have a capacity limitation, because a capacity limitation means a large order backlog. And a large order backlog is very comfortable, because if I have 10 weeks worth of orders, I am immune to sudden drops in demand, and I think I would like to have large orders. And so, back in better times, a few years ago at least, you could look through any 10 annual reports of corporations, and in probably 7 of them, you would find in a letter to the stockholders written by the president, said with great pride, this year we have twice as big an order backlog as last year. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? What he's really saying is we're making our customers wait twice as long this year as last year, and we are giving our market away to people that don't make them wait as long. That's what he's really saying. And that is not perceived. I mean, perhaps it seems obvious to you, but it is just remarkable how hard it is for people immersed in the complexity of a management situation to see the kinds of trade-offs that they're faced with. They are so imbued with the idea that lower prices produce sales that they will reduce price to increase sales and increase the order backlog and slide out along this curve by just a corresponding amount. That reduces profits, that reduces the ability to expand, But by reducing price and giving up longer delivery delay, you have a well-balanced system that leads to the kind of stagnation on the previous slide. Very important to be able to include psychological variables in models of human systems. Here's one of eroding goal structure, very common in all of our social systems. Situation where we have some present condition. It may be product quality, it might be that delivery delay we talked about, it might be the integrity of the organization, but some present situation which we compare with the present effective goal to take some action. Action based on the difference between how things are now and how we would like them to be. Now, how do we decide what we would like them to be? Because goals don't come down from heaven. They get generated somewhere. And one of the ways that they get generated is to look back at what we've done in the past, the traditions of the organization. And what does the tradition mean? The tradition means the average of what we have done in the past. So the present condition gets averaged and delayed to become the traditional condition, and that's one of the inputs to the effective goal. The other input I will call the absolute goal. Now, there is no such thing truly, absolute goal, but the absolute goal held by certain very strong and perceptive managers is a goal that will transcend difficulty, a goal that they will adhere to and stay with and come back to even after several years of failing to meet it. They know it's their goal. They want to come back to it. But many managers don't have that. If you do not have an absolute goal here, and the traditional goal becomes the effective goal, then you see what happens. As we fail to meet our goals, the present condition is less than we would like, the goal goes down, the effective goal goes down, we're always under pressure that keeps us from quite meeting our effective goal, and so what we do is the present condition, which is a little less than we would like, which becomes the tradition, which becomes the lower goal. In some new companies, you can see this spiral to extinction go on in a matter of 3 or 4 years. A company will start with the idea we're going to sell the best product, the highest quality, the promptest delivery, the best service, the lowest price. I've already described an impossible circumstance, but that's what they will start with. And then they find life is tough. And next year they don't quite meet it. And they tell you, well, life is tough, we can't quite meet it. But people don't like to have the dissidence in their life. And if you can't meet it, there's a tendency to adjust the goal to suit the reality. And a year later, they'll say, well, you know, we were wrong about that. You really can't do it. That's not the nature of the market. We had to reduce our goals. 2 years after that, gone farther. 4 years, they will deny they ever said what they said the first year. Because now they have come completely at ease in a downward spiral, eroding set of goals. Airplane pilots have a term for this. It's called the dead man's spiral, where you fly into a fog bank without blind flying ability or instruments, and you feel that you're diving, and you pull back on the stick, and that doesn't seem to get you out of the sense that you're diving. You pull back further. Well, the whole thing is being misperceived. You weren't diving. You were in a tight turn. You pull back on the stick, tighten up the turn, you keep doing this till the wings come off. And this same sort of thing goes on in our corporate and social systems. A word about the nature of our information sources. I've said already something about the mental database. Let's look at 3 kinds of information. The information that collectively we carry around in our heads, the information that's written down in the newspapers and journals and libraries, and the information that's available to us in measured numerical form. There is vastly more information in the mental database, orders of magnitude more information in the mental database than there is in the written database. There are no set of written instructions which you could turn over to a set of novices and expect them to run MIT. There is no written instructions for how to build an automobile. These things are all learned by being there, by apprenticeship. one learns about some of the underlying science, but when it comes to really doing important things, there are no written instructions. And in turn, the written database is vastly richer than the numerical database, again by orders of magnitude. There's been a tendency in the social sciences to focus largely on the numerical database. It is my feeling that one is thereby excluding the vast amount of information that the real world operates on. And if you're going to model the real world, you should use the information that the real world is using. So we place a heavy dependence on the verbal, descriptive, interview, being there kind of information. That's looked upon with considerable skepticism by many people. They say it is subjective, intuitive, non-scientific. I would suggest that science is non-scientific. There are no 10 rules that I know of that will guarantee that you get a Nobel Prize in physics. That on the frontier of science, it is highly non-scientific. It is subjective, intuitive, and so is, I think, dealing with any of the realities of the world around us. We have no objection to using numerical data, and we do wherever it's available, but I'd simply say that's not where the most of the information, in fact, resides. Let's look at our mental images in 3 other dimensions. If we would divide everything we know about the systems around us into 3 categories, one category would be what we have observed or know about the structure and the policies. Who's connected to whom, what flows where, and why do people do what they do in the short run, in the immediate, instantaneous situation. Then we have expectations about the behavior that will arise from this observed structure. And then we have observations about the actual behavior. Congress passes a law because they think the law will lead to some expected behavior, and it doesn't happen. It leads to some other behavior. And when that happens, there is almost a universal tendency to say, it didn't work out right because we must have been mistaken about the parts. We must have been mistaken about the policies, the connections, or the structure. Indeed, that's not generally the trouble. That if you take this observed structure and what people know to be the policies and structure of the system and put them into a computer simulation model, you get the actual behavior. The dissidence, the discrepancy in this diagram is not between the observed behavior and actual, it is between the observed behavior and what we believe that structure implies. Or, put it another way, the discrepancy is in the solution to that 20th order nonlinear differential equation. We know the pieces, we expect it to behave in a certain way, that expectation is incorrect, and actually it behaves in a way that's quite consistent with the structure that we know if we come to the point where we can see and understand the behavior that is implied by that structure. I'd like to stress a little bit more the idea of the integrations or levels in a system. Integration alters the time shape of something that goes into it. If you pour a constant stream of water into a barrel, the water rises continuously. The constant stream of water leads to a rising level in the barrel. An increasing stream of water leads to a parabola, an upward sweeping curve.